True or false? The U.S. does not recognize the legal right to reparations for historical wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred. And the statement was made by Ambassador Dan Negria from the U.S. representatives um, at the UN. Now, he basically said this nearly verbatim before the UN General Assembly vote on March 25th, 2026, on a resolution for a resolution on slavery and reparations. Now, I know he said it, but we're trying to figure out is this statement true? Does the U.S. recognize wrongs that were not illegal under international law at the time they occurred, right? So, in hindsight, the sharper answer is, the U.S. doesn't generally recognize the international legal right to reparations, especially for conduct that was not illegal under international law when it happened. But that is not the same as saying that the U.S. does not recognize those acts as wrong. Now, the distinction matters a lot because, his statement was making a legal argument about retroactive liability under international law. The argument basically lines up with principles of state responsibility. The state is ordinarily responsible, for only a breach of an international obligation, that was enforced for that state at the time of that act. Now, um, the U.S. is absolutely recognized some past acts as wrong, even when the issue was addressed through domestic law, politics, or moral morality rather than international legal duty. A clean example was the Civil Liberties Act of 1998, 88, pardon me, where Congress apologized for the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans and authorized compensation. That shows the U.S. can acknowledge grave injustice and pay reparations like compensation, even without conceding a general international law rule for historical wrongs. So, if the question is, does the U.S. accept the binding international legal duty to pay reparations for historical acts that were not illegal under international law at the time? Is usually no. That's basically the position that, Buddy was taking, Negria, he was stating that, But if the question is, can the U.S. recognize those acts as immoral, unjust, shameful, or worthy of apology or redress anyway? Yeah. History shows that it can, and sometimes does, right? So at the end of the day, we know that through Japanese compensation that, it can, and it sometimes does. So Negria's statement is, sort of legally narrow and politically strategic if you think about it, right? And so it's basically, kind of like said in that way to, shut down a legal claim for reparations at the UN, especially at the UN where, they don't necessarily have to hear that. It doesn't prove that the U.S. thinks that underlying acts were acceptable, right? It just proves that the U.S. does not want historical wrongs converted to a present-day international legal obligation. So, with that being said, can't take videos for face value and think that the U.S. doesn't respect the the rules and regulations that set forth, especially in a legally binding way. So, can it become a legal obligation? Maybe, but not automatically. It sort of has to be created, through law, agreement, or some type of substantial or sustained pressure. There's some ways that it could happen, though, right? You can go to international law, um, with treaties or global agreements. You know what I'm saying? Um, Countries can agree to new rules that say reparations are required even for historical wrongs. You know, an example would be like nations give like um, or nations can create treaties recognizing slavery or colonialisms as crimes that require repair, or if the U.S. signs and ratifies, it becomes legally bound. If it doesn't sign, it can be avoided. Um, you know, Being bound. You know what I'm saying? So like, a reality check, right? The U.S. They kind of careful about signing anything that creates open-ended financial liability. So it's possible, but politically, it's kind of hard. So